Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 12 of the FAFO Academy Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Gemma. And today we will be talking about everybody thinks they're the good guy and why this is and how this actually plays out in real life. Very few people wake up in the morning trying to be selfish, dishonest, manipulative, or cruel. Most people justify their behavior with a story that makes them a hero. Understanding that doesn't excuse bad behavior, but it does explain it. And if you understand it, you can and will become much better at dealing with people. So let's start with a question. Have you ever watched someone lie, cheat, betray a friend, destroy a relationship, or completely screw over a business partner and just wondered, like, how does that person sleep at night? Well, the answer is actually way simpler than you might think because most of them don't believe they are the bad guy. It's almost synonymous or analogous to the liar who actually believes their own lies. Now, ask yourself, have you ever heard someone say, well, I had no choice, or they deserved it, or I'm doing what's best for me or my family, or you don't know the whole story? Well, they're not just excuses, they're psychological shields, they're defense mechanisms, because almost nobody wants to see that they're actually the villain. So, we're going to talk about one of the most powerful forces in human behavior. And it goes back to the title of this episode. Everyone thinks they're the good guy, but you could also think of that inversely as well. No one thinks they're the bad guy. Now, the brain protects its own identity, protects your identity. People don't just feel the need to protect, for example, their reputation with other people. That reputation first needs to be protected within. And that's something that we don't even realize that we do. But it's something that we subconsciously do on a daily basis. You protect it with yourself first. So, for example, if someone cheats on their spouse, they rarely think, I'm a shitty person. Instead, they create this mental narrative, whether it's true or not, emotionally based in reality, based in emotion, or a mixture of all of that. It doesn't matter. They'll say to themselves, well, the marriage was already over. They don't love me anymore. Or I fell out of love with them. Or I'm not happy anymore. I deserve to be happy. And they come up with these excuses that justify their deceitful behavior. And these mental subconscious excuses that they make protect them and they shield them from their own identity. It keeps that identity intact. The identity is, I am not bad. I am good. Some business examples could be, You overcharge a customer because you needed to cover costs, or you lied to a client because you justified it with, well, I was just protecting my business. Now, those things in and of themselves don't necessarily make someone a bad person or a good person. They are simply examples of what could be done, what can be done, and what is being done in someone's life in a given period of time. So you take those examples, and now you can see clearly, I never thought of it that way before. I was actually telling myself that these things I did or was doing or am doing, they're not bad because um, I'm justifying them. And again, that justification is not always outwardly conscious. Sometimes it's simply subconscious, because people don't usually consciously decide to lie to themselves, because admitting you are your own problem is psychologically painful. Most people don't rewrite history to fool you. They rewrite history to fool themselves. And that segues into intentions versus impact. This is where a lot of relationships fall apart, because people judge themselves by intention. They judge everyone else by impact. For example, when someone says, well, I didn't mean to hurt you, the other person says, but you did. Think about that. The amount of times people said to you, no offense, but it's along the same lines, because the person knows what they're about to say is a shitty thing. Even if it might be true, there's a time and a place to say that, if at all. Now, by saying it doesn't necessarily mean you're a bad person or a good person, because an argument could be made either way. For example, myself, I would rather someone tell me, hey, Alex, you're doing a shitty job, or you could be doing it better, or you shouldn't do it that way because A, B, and C. I want that feedback, even if other people would receive that same type of feedback as criticism, because, like I've said in many of my other videos, I welcome forms of criticism like that because I want to better myself. And that is not coming from an egotistical standpoint. It's simply coming from a growth standpoint. Now let's take a look at a business example. Well, I didn't mean to ignore that customer. But the truth is, the customer doesn't give a shit how you felt or what you were doing. All they know and all they experienced is that they were ignored. So you see, the customer doesn't care. The impact is what they experienced. And these misunderstandings grow because everyone uses a different measuring stick. Now, what does that mean? It's a perspective issue. The customer doesn't see it from your point of view, and you don't see it from their point of view. That's why we have to also separate IQ and EQ. We have this thing called empathy, and a lot of people think that they can empathize when they really can't. They do a shitty job. Empathizing essentially means putting yourself in the other person's position, but you can't do that from your own fucking position. You have to do it from their fucking position. And that's the problem with this empathy idea. People say, well, If I was in their place, I wouldn't feel that way. That is exactly the opposite of what empathy is and what empathy is supposed to be. So again, that's the different measuring stick, the perspective. You need to be able to put yourself in the other person's position. Do not judge yourself by what you meant to say. I want you to stop doing that because everyone else judges you by what you did. Even if what you didn't mean to have the outcome that it did, other people still perceive it as you did it. Rationalization is more powerful than lying. Let's take a look at that for a second. Now, we have confirmation bias, right? But we also have rationalization as a tool. And the tool is simply, well, I'm doing this or I did that because A, B, and C. It doesn't make it right. And the way that other people perceive that decision is not necessarily going to be from your perspective. Most lies are not told to other people. You tell yourself the lies. For example, well, I'm going to start next week. I'm too busy. Now just isn't the right time. Well, I wouldn't have failed if I was just being honest. Or you challenge people. We need to ask, how many decisions in your own life have you justified with the story that felt true in that moment? So it's not about being a hypocrite. It's about being human. So think about a time that you made a decision. So let's say, for example, your spouse gave you their credit card to use to buy groceries one time. And you still have that card or you still have access to that card. Now you've already bought the groceries. And that was what the original permission was for. And then you go out again and you buy groceries with that same card. And you justify it because, well, I needed to eat. I needed food. I was hungry. But technically, you didn't have permission. You see? So the justification is, well, I just needed food. I needed to eat. Could even be for something more stupid. But in this case, that would be probably even the conscious justification is that, well, it was okay because, I needed to eat and I was hungry. But did it really make it okay? I don't know. What do you think? But that was how you felt in that moment. And that's why you did what you did. And take crimes of passion, for example. People become irate in the moment. For example, they see their spouse cheating actively and they murder the other person, or they commit a double murder and murder them both. Well, in that moment, that's how they felt. They felt that was what they needed to do. It doesn't mean that other people see it that way. Now, there's a lot of crimes of passion that occur every day. It's very common, much more common than you'd think if you look at the statistics. But that story is something that's put in front of your face in that moment, and that's how those people felt. Now, that doesn't justify it necessarily. That doesn't mean that they deserved it. And whether or not someone deserves something, that's a whole nother thing. So remember, the most convincing lies are actually the ones we tell ourselves. And you see that that's been a recurring theme here. This is why conflict rarely actually gets resolved. Going back to the example I just gave, think about two people arguing, right? Starts there, right? Each one has evidence and each one has memories and each one has reasons. But here's the catch: both parties believe that they're both being reasonable at the same time. And that actually could be the case. That's why simply presenting facts does not usually resolve conflict, though, because the facts actually compete with the other person's identity. Remember, this all goes back to the beginning of the podcast episode. People are trying to protect themselves. I'm not the bad guy. I'm a good guy. Whether that's a subconscious or conscious thought, it doesn't matter. It could be both, a mixture. The point is, they're protecting that identity. So when the facts contradict that, they're not going to solve the conflict because they're not actually protecting the facts. They're protecting their identity. They're protecting themselves. So when the facts contradict that, doesn't solve arguments, doesn't solve it at all, because the facts are competing with the identity. And if accepting your version means admitting you're the asshole, well, your brain's going to automatically resist that. And you need to be cognizant of that. And that is why winning an argument is really a myth. Because to win an argument is almost the other person admitting not just that they were wrong, but that they could have actually been acting or they did something outside of who they actually believe they are. And it hits at their core identity. So people don't just defend opinions, they defend the version of themselves attached to those opinions. And we have this danger of always being the hero. Let's look at this from an intro perspective. So let's do some introspecting. When was the last time you honestly asked yourself, what role did I play in this? So, for example, how did I affect a failed business or a broken relationship or a divorce or an employee quitting or a family conflict? So I want you to take a moment and ask yourself if you've ever experienced any of those things in the recent past or something adjacent to that. Ask yourself what your role was in that as a contributor. What was it as a contributor? Because if you're always the hero and you never have any fault and you're never taking any responsibility for what happened, then someone else always has to be the villain. Now, there's this age-old saying, it takes two to tango. And that doesn't just mean in the dancing sense. It literally means if there's an argument, there's got to be two sides, or at least more than one differing view or perspective. And sometimes it's just the frame. Sometimes it's not even what you say, and it's more of the presentation and how you're saying it. So it's dangerous to move through life thinking that you're always the good guy. Now, it's also dangerous, equally, probably, to think that you're always the bad guy. We need to establish an equilibrium here because probably the truth really lies in the center. And now I'm not saying that you have to label yourself as a villain or the good guy in all situations. I'm just saying that you need to be cognizant of it because if you're always pointing the finger, that's dangerous. Growth begins when you're willing to examine your own part without assuming you're entirely at fault. Self awareness begins the moment you stop casting yourself as the hero in every story. Understanding is not the same as excusing. My grandmother always used to say, there's a fine line between a good Joe and a sucker. Don't be the sucker. And see, there's an important distinction here. Understanding why someone behaves the way they do doesn't mean you tolerate it. You can understand manipulation and still have limits and boundaries established. You can understand betrayal and you can still just walk away. Empathy doesn't require permission. Understanding behavior gives you clarity, not obligations. Remember, empathy is more than just putting yourself in the other person's shoes. It's literally putting on their shoes with their fucking feet. There's another branch to that people don't see. If you have high EQ, you're automatically doing that. You're not just imagining yourself in their shoes. You need to actually do it from their perspective. And that's so important to remember because understanding someone explains their behavior, but it doesn't erase the consequences. So think about, for example, the murderer who gets interviewed by all these shrinks and they're deemed unfit to stand trial. It still doesn't erase the fact that they murdered someone. So let's apply this system breaker mindset, right? As obviously, I wrote the System Breakers Guide. And if we apply that mindset to this, the people who navigate life well, they simply ask different questions. You know, instead of who's right, they ask what story or what narrative are each of these people running in their own minds? And that question changes everything. Changes how we negotiate, for example, leadership in parenting, marriage, friendships, business, all aspects of life this can be applied to because once you understand the story, you understand the behavior. And once you understand the behavior, it's far more predictable than most people think. Now, let's bring this all together. Most people are not trying to be the bad guy. They're trying to protect the image of themselves. And that realization changes how you see conflict. And it changes how you negotiate. It literally changes everything you do in life, how you lead, whether you succeed or you fail. And most importantly, it changes how honestly you're willing to look at yourself. So I'll leave you with like a final challenge here. The next time you find yourself in an argument, instead of asking yourself, why are they acting this way? Ask, what story are they telling themselves that justifies this behavior? Because Understanding why people justify their behavior won't stop them from making bad decisions, but it will and can help you make better ones.